Thanks for staying with us here on My News 26. I'm Eric Wotilla with a special edition of Spotlight. We're joined here in the studio by Congressman John Moolenaar, and I'd like to thank you for taking some time to stop by today.
Thanks for inviting me to join you.
And of course, you have been representing Northern Michigan in Washington for some time now, and I understand there's been quite a few issues you've been following out there. Do you want to tell the constituents who may be watching a little bit about what you've been working on in Washington?
Sure. Well, I was sworn in early January and was appointed to 3 different committees: the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Agriculture, and Budget Committee. And the first work that we did really was with the Budget Committee, and we were required to have a budget that balanced within 10 years and that did not raise taxes, and we wanted to get one that was unified between the House and the Senate. This is the first time that's happened in a long time, and we were successful in doing that. On the Science Committee, we have some oversight of the EPA, and one of the concerns I heard a lot when I campaigned was the waters of the U.S. and some of the EPA overreach was affecting farmers and small businesses and home builders and families who own property, and having the EPA step up their role in regulatory bureaucracy. And then thirdly, the Agriculture Committee. There's been so much happening. Want to make sure Michigan exports of agriculture and that we continue to grow our agricultural base. In the 4th District, we have 10,000 farms, 15,000 farmers, and so it's a very significant part of our economy. And we're working on trade policies as well as some of the labeling issues for food. And so it's been a very active first few months of the session.
You know, and you brought up that Agriculture Committee, which is, of course, here in Northern Michigan, a very big and important aspect of the economy for a lot of people. You mentioned you're working on some trade issues. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on some of these key issues that you've really heard a lot about from people in the area and things you're working on that note?
Sure. Well, one of the concerns was overreach by the EPA. You know, one of the great things about our country is we have a government that has checks and balances. You have the executive branch and the legislative branch, and Congress really needs to have oversight of the EPA and some of the administration agencies. And with this president, clearly those agencies have overstepped their bounds. In fact, even the court has agreed with us on those things. And so we've been fighting an expansionist EPA. Not that the EPA doesn't have an important role. I mean, I would love to see the EPA really step up and keep the Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. But when it comes to regulating water and mud puddles on farmers' property, that's just too far, and it's just not the best use of government resources. So that's been one issue. The trade policies, one of the things we worked on in a bipartisan way is making sure there's a way to bring trade agreements before Congress for an up-down vote, in a way that when you're negotiating with multiple countries involving trade, it wouldn't be nickeled and dimed in Congress, you know, with different amendments and then have to go back to those countries. So we passed legislation, the Trade Promotion Authority, that allows that to come before Congress in a very transparent way. The first trade policy that will likely come before us under this new law is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated by the trade negotiator and the different countries in the Pacific Rim as well as Canada. And they just released the details of that proposal. We're going to be examining it, see its impact on agriculture, manufacturing, making sure that before we enter into any agreements that they're good for our country. And I would say the jury's out on this proposal.
Sure. And obviously a lot of proposals that are in exactly that situation that you're looking on. Now, one that seems to have been at least relatively decided here is Keystone XL pipeline, which I understand the Obama administration has said they're not going to approve. And I understand you were a supporter of that idea and had some thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's important that we have energy independence in our country, that we also have jobs, and this would have been both. It would have created jobs, both manufacturing jobs and skilled labor jobs. It would have helped with our energy independence. To me, it made a lot of sense, and this was actually an area where Congress agreed in a bipartisan way, and put a bill on the president's desk, which he vetoed. And of course, he vetoed it and said that he had his own investigation going on and would look at it in his own timing. But clearly he had a bias against the project to begin with, and it's something that I think is going to make our energy prices higher, and we're going to lose the opportunity for those jobs. So I think it was a mistake. It was something I think that he was convinced that part of the environmental activism on global warming and anti-oil, anti-natural gas, anti-pretty much any form of energy, I think he was buying into that, and unfortunately our economy will suffer because of it.
And for anybody who may have heard the term Keystone XL pipeline but not be intimately familiar with what the project would have entailed, can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, it was a project that actually originates in Canada and would come through and bring oil to the Gulf states and would have created jobs all the way through. And every indication I had was the scientific studies that were done showed that there wasn't an environmental harm, and it would have created a lot of jobs. It would have also made it more attractive for manufacturing to grow jobs in the United States. As a result, if energy costs are higher, that makes investing here in our country less attractive. And so that's what it was, and it's been looked at for 7 years. It's a great example of business and investment needs certainty. And so when you have a business that applies for a permit, they should get a quick evaluation, and if it's not a good project, then deny the permit. But to go for 7 years without any demonstration of adverse effects and then to be turned down, to me is just unacceptable.
Certainly, and that makes a lot of sense. One last issue I'd like to discuss, and this is one that has not been perhaps heavily in the public eye. I know we've chatted a little bit about this in the past, is the spectrum auction that's pending for next year and the FCC's goal of reallocating some of the TV spectrum to other uses such as cellular use. And I'm curious about some of your thoughts on this issue, and I know a lot of people in Congress have been working on the details of that auction and what it would entail for the public. And I'm curious what you personally have been working on and what that entails for people.
Well, I'll tell you, it's something where I should turn it over and ask you for your perspective, because you've got a lot of experience in this area. And this is an area where the FCC, we want to make sure, is looking out for the interests of people all across our country and the ability to access communication. And so and we want a level playing field that benefits people, whether it's small or large, and we want to have that kind of accessibility. And so I'm monitoring the situation. I'm listening to people who know this area inside and out, and so it's one of those. It's as many issues. You try and take positions as you have clarity based on the information you get, and so my approach is always to try and listen to all sides and come to a good, responsible conclusion. But to do that, especially in these areas of technology where the technology is expanding so rapidly, and government can make some huge mistakes if we aren't deliberative and thoughtful about how we approach it. One of the things I enjoy about this job is that you're always learning new things, and whether it's technology, kind of the advances that are being made there. One of the areas that, as a state legislator, I did not deal with foreign policy issues. And so I've had to learn, some of our national defense issues, some of the, just the international affairs that are happening. And so, the issue of the Iran deal came up, and I've really studied to learn as much as I could about how this deal, the president's proposed deal, affected our allies like Israel, how it affected the region in terms of an escalating arms race there. When you consider the rise of terrorism and groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, and the geopolitical issues, those are issues where we try and understand based on what we know in this country. But one of the fortunate things our job enabled us to go over and talk with the leaders in Israel and visit and talk to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He had given a speech before a joint session of Congress and was very compelling about his concerns about this Iran deal. And so to be able to go over to Israel to see the border issues that they have, whether it's the civil war in Syria or Gaza where they're firing rockets into Israel, the idea that we're going to allow Iran to pursue an arms buildup is very troubling. But those are the kinds of things, the only way you learn is talking to the experts and making sure that you're making the wisest decisions possible.
And I was, just going to say, and you kind of led into it on your own accord, going from a state legislator to federal, you're learning about new issues that you didn't have to deal with.
Sure.
And I guess I would assume, perhaps it's a foolish assumption, but you run into people who are asking about smaller issues that are not necessarily the key areas you are familiar with. Are there any of those other smallish issues, like I said, not involving foreign relations, not involving necessarily agriculture, but that you've really heard things from people about maybe looking into?
One of the great things about, we serve 15 counties, and now with people writing or calling, and obviously with email, people are able to communicate very quickly. So we may hear from a few hundred people on an issue as it's going through Congress. Some of the similarities and differences between the state and the federal government, the budget issue is one that has been very important to learn kind of the differences where, in state government you have a balanced budget requirement and you have targets for the budgets and you have to live within that because of the balanced budget requirement. In the federal government we don't have that, and so it's very difficult to have that discipline to make sure that Congress is not spending more than is budgeted. And so that's been a learning curve, and I heard a lot most recently. We had a proposal for a 2-year budget that came through, and I actually voted against it because I just didn't believe it was leading us down a fiscally responsible path. And so when you consider that, it took 200 years to develop a $5 trillion debt, and then by 2007 we were up to 10 trillion, and now it's 18 trillion with this new budget agreement. It was up to 20 trillion, and that's just unacceptable for future generations. And so those are things, as a state legislator, you have the opportunity to develop skills, but there are some improvements we need to make on the federal level.
Excellent. And again, I'm told we have to wrap up here. Any last comments before we wrap up the segment?
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I want people to feel comfortable contacting our office. It's a real honor to serve in this role, and it's a challenging time for our country, and I want to be someone who represents the best of our constituents here in mid and northern Michigan, and just honored to have the privilege to serve.
Certainly. Well, thank you for being on the show, Congressman Moolenaar. And again, you've been watching a special spotlight interview with Congressman John Moolenaar here on My News 26. We'll be right back after this.